The border didn't start this fight, the economy did. And right now, two of the most powerful leaders in the Western Hemisphere are locked in a negotiation that most Americans don't fully understand because the mainstream media keeps reducing it to walls, migrants, and political theater. But what's actually happening between Donald Trump and Claudia Sheinbaum goes far deeper than any headline you've seen this week. Mexico isn't just a neighbor, it's the United States' largest trading partner, surpassing even China. Every automobile rolling off a Detroit assembly line, every avocado on your kitchen counter, every semiconductor component keeping American factories alive. It moves through a relationship that Washington has historically treated as a one-way street. And that arrogance, it's finally catching up. Claudia Sheinbaum didn't send Trump an urgent message out of weakness. She sent it because Mexico now holds genuine leverage, economic, geographic, and geopolitical, that this administration cannot afford to ignore. And the question every American should be asking right now isn't what did she say? It's why is Trump listening? Let's start with some basic economic history, because without it, none of what's happening right now makes any sense. For most of the 20th century, the United States operated with a very simple assumption about Mexico, that it was a dependent nation, dependent on American investment, American tourism, American goodwill, and American political tolerance. Washington policymakers, whether Republican or Democrat, largely treated Mexico the way a landlord treats a struggling tenant. You can negotiate the rent, sure, but ultimately you need us more than we need you. That assumption shaped decades of trade policy, immigration policy, drug enforcement policy, and diplomatic strategy. And for a long time, especially through the Cold War era, it had some basis in reality. Mexico's economy was deeply tied to American capital flows, and when the United States sneezed, Mexico caught a serious fever. But here's what the landlord didn't notice: the tenants started building equity. NAFTA, which went into effect in 1994, was sold to the American public as a gift to Mexico. American politicians, particularly those on the left, warned that jobs would flood south of the border. Ross Perot famously called it that giant sucking sound. And yes, certain industries did relocate. Certain factory towns in Ohio and Michigan felt that pain deeply and personally. But what nobody fully anticipated was that Mexico would use NAFTA not just as a labor destination, but as a launching pad for genuine industrial development. Mexican manufacturing didn't just absorb low-wage assembly work. Over time, it built supply chains, technical expertise, logistics infrastructure, and, critically, it became indispensable to American production itself. By the time the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA, replaced NAFTA in 2020, Mexico had quietly become something the architects of the original deal never intended: a genuine economic power with real negotiating leverage. And then something else happened that changed everything. China rose, and the United States panicked when Washington began its serious confrontation with Beijing through tariffs, technology restrictions, semiconductor export controls, and strategic decoupling. American corporations suddenly needed an alternative. They needed a place close to home with a skilled workforce, existing infrastructure, and a favorable trade agreement already in place. They needed, in a word, Mexico. The phenomenon that economists started calling nearshoring exploded almost overnight. Companies that had spent 30 years building supply chains in Shenzhen and Guangzhou started looking at Monterrey and Guadalajara with fresh eyes. Tesla, BMW, IKEA, Samsung, major global corporations began either expanding existing Mexican operations or establishing entirely new ones. Between 2022 and 2024, foreign direct investment into Mexico hit record levels. The Mexican peso defying almost every prediction from financial analysts who still thought of it as a volatile emerging market currency. became one of the strongest performing currencies in the entire world. This is the Mexico that Claudia Sheinbaum inherited when she took office. And this is the Mexico that Donald Trump is now dealing with, not the Mexico of 1994, not even the Mexico of 2016, but a Mexico with real cards to play. Now, let's talk about Claudia Sheinbaum herself, because the American media has done a remarkably poor job of explaining who this woman is and what she actually represents. The narrative in most American coverage tends to reduce her to either a continuation of her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, often called AMLO, or a kind of left-wing figurehead without real political independence. Both of these characterizations are lazy and wrong. Sheinbaum is a scientist by training, a climate researcher. She has a PhD. She served as head of government of Mexico City, one of the largest and most complex urban environments on the planet. She won the 2024 Mexican presidential election with a historic margin, the largest electoral victory in modern Mexican history. She is not a figurehead. She is not a puppet. And she is not, as some American commentators seem to assume, simply waiting for Washington's approval before she makes her next move. What Sheinbaum represents is something genuinely new in Mexican political history. A leader who comes from the progressive tradition of AMLO's Morena party, but who also brings a technocratic competence and an international credibility that AMLO himself sometimes lacked. She speaks the language of climate agreements, of scientific governance, of multilateral institutions. She can walk into a room with European leaders and be taken seriously on her own terms. She can also walk into a room with Chinese diplomats and have a productive conversation. That diplomatic flexibility, that ability to play multiple tables simultaneously, is precisely what gives her leverage with Washington. Because Trump's Washington, perhaps more than any previous administration, understands leverage. It respects power. And Sheinbaum, whether Trump's team wants to admit it or not, has it. So what was in this urgent message? What was Sheinbaum actually communicating to Trump? Because the details matter and they reveal something important about where this relationship is heading. At the core of the communication was a set of interrelated issues that have been building tension between the two governments for months. The first and most immediately explosive is the tariff question. Trump's administration has repeatedly floated, and in some cases actually implemented, tariff threats against Mexican goods. The justification has shifted depending on the news cycle. Sometimes it's about fentanyl, sometimes it's about immigration, sometimes it's about trade imbalances. But the economic reality underneath all of this political noise is that tariffs on Mexican goods don't just hurt Mexico. They hurt American consumers, American manufacturers, and American workers in ways that are direct, measurable, and politically uncomfortable. When you put a tariff on auto parts coming from Mexico, you are raising the price of cars assembled in Michigan. When you put a tariff on agricultural products from Mexico, you are raising grocery bills for American families who are already stretched thin by years of inflation. This is not theory, this is basic supply chain economics. And Sheinbaum's message, delivered through diplomatic channels with a precision that reflects her scientific background, essentially made this case in terms that even a transactional political mind could understand. You hurt us, you hurt yourself, and here is the data to prove it. But the message didn't stop there, because Sheinbaum also raised the question of Chinese investment in Mexico, and this is where things get genuinely geopolitically fascinating. One of Trump's core anxieties, and it's not an entirely unreasonable one, is that nearshoring to Mexico could become a backdoor through which Chinese companies essentially circumvent American tariffs. If a Chinese automaker builds a factory in Monterrey and exports cars from there into the United States under USMCA terms that defeats the entire purpose of the tariff strategy against China, this is a real concern. And Sheinbaum knows it. What her message essentially conveyed was a kind of offer Mexico is willing to work with the United States on screening and limiting Chinese investment in sensitive sectors, but that cooperation requires something in return. It requires Washington to treat Mexico as a partner rather than a subordinate. It requires tariff relief. It requires respect for Mexican sovereignty on issues like drug enforcement strategy, where the two governments have had serious and ongoing disagreements. In other words, Sheinbaum came to the table not with a plea, but with a proposition. And that is a fundamentally different kind of diplomatic posture than Washington has been accustomed to seeing from Mexico City. Now, let's step back and look at the broader picture, because what's happening between the United States and Mexico right now is not an isolated bilateral drama. It's a reflection of something much larger that's reshaping the entire global order. We are living through a period of what serious scholars of international relations call hegemonic transition. The United States, which exercised essentially unchallenged global dominance from 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, until roughly the mid-2010s, is now operating in a world where that dominance is genuinely contested. China is the obvious challenger, but the transition is more complex than a simple US-China rivalry suggests. What we're actually seeing is a fragmentation of the old unipolar order into something more multipolar, a world where regional powers, middle powers, and even smaller nations have more room to maneuver than they did during the height of American hegemony. Mexico is a perfect case study in this dynamic. During the unipolar moment, Mexico essentially had one option: align with Washington and make the best of it. Today, Mexico has options. It can deepen its economic relationship with China. It can pursue stronger ties with the European Union. It can play a leadership role in Latin American politics through forums like CELAC. It can use its geographic position, sitting between the world's largest economy to the north and a rapidly growing set of economies to the south, as genuine strategic leverage. Sheinbaum understands this. Her government's foreign policy, while it won't be openly confrontational with Washington, is built on a quiet assertion of Mexican agency that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. And here's where it gets interesting for the American audience, because this has direct implications for your daily life in ways that go beyond the price of avocados. The United States needs Mexico's cooperation on several fronts simultaneously. It needs it on immigration because the physical reality of the US-Mexico border means that Mexican enforcement cooperation is essential to any serious border management strategy, walls notwithstanding. It needs it on fentanyl because the precursor chemicals that feed the American opioid crisis move through complex transnational networks that require Mexican law enforcement partnership to disrupt. It needs it economically because the manufacturing integration between the two countries is now so deep that disentangling it would be enormously costly and would take decades. And it needs it geopolitically because a Mexico that drifts toward China or even just significantly increases Chinese economic engagement represents a genuine strategic problem for Washington that no amount of tariff threats can solve. Trump, to his credit, and I say this not as an endorsement but as an analytical observation, has a gut-level instinct for leverage. He understands, even if he doesn't always articulate it clearly, that relationships are transactions and that transactions require both parties to feel they're getting something. The question is whether the transactional framework that worked in New York real estate can be successfully applied to the complexities of 21st century geopolitics. Because what Sheinbaum is offering is not simply a transaction. She's offering a structural realignment of how the two countries relate to each other, a relationship based on mutual benefit and acknowledged interdependence rather than American dominance and Mexican acquiescence. That's a bigger ask. And whether Trump's Washington can conceptually absorb it is genuinely uncertain. Let's talk about the fentanyl crisis for a moment because it keeps appearing in these conversations and it deserves serious treatment rather than political theater. The framing that dominates American political discourse on this issue, that Mexico is allowing or even facilitating fentanyl to flood into the United States, is both partially true and profoundly misleading. It's partially true in the sense that Mexican criminal organizations, particularly the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, are deeply involved in fentanyl trafficking. That's documented, that's real. But what the political framing systematically omits is that fentanyl is an American demand crisis as much as it is a Mexican supply crisis. The precursor chemicals that Mexican cartels use to manufacture fentanyl come primarily from China. The distribution networks that get fentanyl into American communities are run by American criminal enterprises as well as Mexican ones. And the underlying social conditions, the economic despair, the lack of healthcare access, the mental health crisis that drive American demand for opioids are entirely made in the USA. Sheinbaum's government has been direct about this. They've essentially said, we will cooperate on law enforcement, we will work with you on interdiction, but we are not going to accept a framing that makes Mexico solely responsible for an American public health catastrophe. And they've also raised carefully but firmly the question of American guns, the firearms that arm Mexican cartels, the assault weapons, the high powered rifles flow south from the United States in enormous quantities. This is not a minor issue. It's not a footnote. Mexican officials have estimated that hundreds of thousands of American guns have crossed into Mexico illegally over the past 2 decades. And they arm the very organizations that Washington then points to as evidence of Mexican government failure. When Sheinbaum raises this in diplomatic communication with Trump, she's not being anti-American, she's being accurate. And accuracy in genuine diplomacy has to be the foundation. Now let's bring this back to the global picture, because the US-Mexico relationship doesn't exist in a vacuum, and understanding the larger context helps explain why this particular moment feels so charged. We are at an extraordinary juncture in world history. The post-World War II international order, the system of institutions, alliances, and norms that the United States built and largely benefited from for 80 years is under simultaneous stress from multiple directions. Trump himself is one source of that stress, having questioned the value of NATO, challenged the role of the World Trade Organization, and adopted an explicitly transactional approach to alliances that previous administrations treated as sacred. China's rise is another source, as Beijing offers developing countries an alternative to the Western-dominated financial and institutional architecture. Russia's invasion of Ukraine shattered the assumption that large-scale territorial war in Europe was a thing of the past, and climate change is beginning to impose its own geopolitical logic as water scarcity, extreme weather, and agricultural disruption drive migration, conflict, and economic instability in ways that no wall and no tariff can address. In this environment, Mexico matters more than ever, not just bilaterally, but as part of a broader North American strategic position. If the United States is going to maintain any version of its global leadership role, if it's going to compete effectively with China, manage the energy transition, stabilize global supply chains, it needs a strong, cooperative, and genuinely prosperous Mexico. A Mexico that is economically vibrant and politically stable is a strategic asset of enormous value. A Mexico that is alienated, economically damaged by punitive tariffs, and diplomatically drifting toward Beijing is a strategic liability that no amount of border theater can compensate for. This is the core argument that Sheinbaum's message was making. And it's an argument grounded not in sentiment or ideology, but in cold strategic logic that any serious foreign policy mind should be able to follow. What's happening right now in global economics also deserves some attention because the macroeconomic backdrop to this story is crucial. The era of cheap money is over. The era of frictionless globalization, where goods, capital, and to a lesser extent people moved across borders with minimal political interference, is over. We're entering a period that economists are calling slowbalization, or sometimes friends whoring, a world where supply chains are being reorganized not purely on the basis of cost efficiency, but on the basis of political reliability. Who do you trust? Whose jurisdiction is safe? Whose legal system will protect your investment? In this environment, Mexico's position is extraordinarily valuable. It's politically stable, certainly more stable than many alternative manufacturing destinations. It has a functioning legal system. It has a democratic government with a legitimate electoral mandate. It has an existing trade framework with the world's largest consumer market. It has a young, growing, increasingly educated workforce. These are not small advantages. They are the foundation of a serious economic future. And Sheinbaum knows it, and she's communicating it to Washington with a clarity and confidence that reflects her own understanding of the moment Mexico is in. Let me talk about something that rarely gets discussed in American media coverage of this relationship, and that's the question of what ordinary Mexican people think about the United States right now, because public opinion matters in democracies, and Sheinbaum leads one. The view of the United States from the Mexican street is complicated and has shifted significantly over the past decade. There's still enormous cultural affinity, families split across the border, shared popular culture, economic ties that reach into almost every Mexican community. But there's also a growing nationalism, a pride in Mexican identity and achievement that coexists with a wariness about American power and American condescension. When Trump threatens tariffs, when American politicians talk about Mexico as if it were a failed state rather than a complex and dynamic society, those comments land in Mexico. They are heard. They generate political energy that Sheinbaum's government has to respond to. She cannot simply capitulate to Washington's demands, even if she wanted to, and because her political coalition, her base, her mandate would not support it. This is the domestic political reality that constrains her options, and it's one that American analysts often underestimate when they model what Mexico should do in response to American pressure. And there's a generational dimension here too. The young Mexicans who are entering the workforce and the political system right now grew up in a different world than the generation that negotiated NAFTA. They grew up with social media, with global connectivity, with awareness of climate change, with the experience of seeing their country navigate a global pandemic. They are more internationally aware, more assertive about Mexican identity, and less automatically deferential to American power than any previous generation. They are Sheinbaum's constituents in the deepest sense, and they will be shaping Mexican politics for the next 30 years. Washington needs to understand this if it wants to build a relationship with Mexico that actually functions over the long term. Now, what happens next? That's the question everyone watching wants answered. The honest answer is it depends on the choices both sides make. If Trump's administration responds with the same bluster and coercion that marked early communications on tariffs and the border, it risks pushing Mexico toward exactly the kind of strategic reorientation Washington should be trying to prevent. A Sheinbaum government that feels cornered will naturally look more closely at Chinese investment, European partnerships, and a stronger role in Latin American regional politics independent of Washington. That's not a threat. It's a logical, strategic response any government in her position would consider. On the other hand, if Trump's team embraces what Sheinbaum is offering, a genuine partnership based on mutual interest with real cooperation on Chinese investment screening, fentanyl precursor interdiction, and immigration management, the potential upside is enormous. A truly integrated North American economic bloc, coordinating supply chains and competing effectively with China, could reshape global competition in ways that benefit American workers, manufacturers, and consumers in lasting ways. The tragedy of American political discourse is that we are trapped in the daily news cycle and performance politics. Immigration becomes a cultural panic rather than a policy problem. Trade becomes a nationalist rallying cry rather than a complex system requiring careful management. Mexico becomes a villain rather than a partner. Meanwhile, the decisions shaping the next 50 years of North American history are being made in negotiations most Americans don't even know exist. That's why Sheinbaum's message matters, not for a quick resolution, but because it represents strategic clarity. Here is what Mexico brings. Here is what it needs. Here is what cooperation looks like. And here is the alternative. How Washington responds will reveal whether the United States is still capable of the long-term strategic thinking that built its global position. Mexico holds the key. Claudia Sheinbaum is holding it out. The question is whether Washington has the wisdom and patience to reach for it.